The city streets were quiet that night, a soft hum of distant traffic weaving through the darkened roads. The faint glow of neon signs flickered against the pavement, casting restless shadows that danced along the sidewalks. Marcus Grant, former NBA star turned community activist, eased his sleek black Escalade through the near-empty streets. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, his tie loosened slightly at the collar, Marcus tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. Still buzzing from the energy of the charity gala he'd attended just an hour earlier, he could still hear the echoes of applause, still feel the warmth of the smiling faces he'd greeted throughout the evening. Tonight had been a good night. Donations had poured in for his foundation, and Marcus felt like he was finally making a difference. But as he passed a dimly lit gas station on the corner of Eastwood Avenue, that feeling of accomplishment vanished. His eyes locked onto something that made his chest tighten. Near the station's entrance, a man knelt on the cold pavement, his hands raised above his head. His tattered jacket barely clung to his frail frame, and his face, hollowed by hunger and exhaustion, was streaked with dirt and sweat. Tobias. That was his name, Marcus remembered. He'd seen him before, a regular in the area, often curled up near the subway entrance with a cardboard sign that read "Just Hungry." But tonight, Tobias wasn't just cold or hungry, he was terrified. Standing over him was Officer Blake, one hand resting dangerously close to the trigger of his holstered gun. The smirk on Blake's face was the kind Marcus knew too well. Smug, arrogant, the kind of look that screamed, "I'm in control, and no one can stop me." Marcus felt his blood boil. "Yo. Y'all see that?" Marcus muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. His eyes flicked to the gas station's parking lot. A crowd had gathered. Customers stood frozen near their cars, phones raised, their faces pale and anxious. Some whispered nervously, others simply stared, unwilling to get involved. Why isn't anyone stopping this? Marcus thought. Without another second of hesitation, Marcus veered his SUV toward the curb and threw it into park. The tires screeched as he swung the door open. Heads turned. People froze. The air seemed to shift as Marcus, 6 feet 9 inches of muscle and confidence, emerged from his car. His polished shoes struck the pavement with purpose, the sharp click echoing through the tense silence. Blake barely glanced at him before sneering. "Keep walking, big guy. This ain't your business." But Marcus didn't stop. He didn't even hesitate. "What's going on here?" Marcus's voice cut through the heavy air, deep, calm, but unmistakably firm. Blake's smirk widened, his fingers twitching dangerously close to his gun. "None of your damn business," he spat, adjusting his stance to block Marcus's path. "I said, walk away." But Marcus Grant? He doesn't walk away. The air hung heavy, thick with tension that clung to every breath. Marcus Grant stood firm, his towering frame locked in place just feet away from Officer Blake. The crowd murmured anxiously, their unease rippling through the cold night air. Some had their phones raised, red recording lights blinking in the dim glow of the gas station's flickering sign. "You heard me," Blake barked, shifting his stance. His hand inched closer to his gun, his fingers flexing along the grip. "I said walk away." But Marcus didn't move. "Man, you're scaring everybody," Marcus said, his voice low and even, but with a force behind it that carried across the parking lot. His eyes locked onto Blake's, unwavering. "Put the gun down." Blake chuckled dryly, that smug grin never leaving his face. "You think you're some kind of hero?" His voice dipped lower, colder. "Maybe you're next." The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and dangerous. Several people gasped. A woman near the front of the crowd clutched her purse tightly to her chest, her wide eyes fixed on the unfolding standoff. "I didn't do anything." Tobias stammered from the pavement, his voice shaking. His arms were still raised, his frail body trembling from fear and exhaustion. I just wanted some food." Blake ignored him, his full attention locked on Marcus now. "Last warning," Blake growled, tilting his head slightly. "Turn around and walk." But Marcus didn't budge. "You're about to make the biggest mistake of your life," Marcus warned, his voice like distant thunder, calm but undeniable. For the first time, the smugness on Blake's face faltered. The confidence he carried so arrogantly was cracking. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected someone to stand their ground. Blake's fingers twitched again, dangerously close to the trigger. The crowd held their breath. Don't, Marcus said, voice firm but calm. Don't do something you can't take back. Blake's breathing hitched for just a second, a moment of hesitation. But pride wouldn't let him back down. His grip tightened, knuckles whitening around the gun's handle. Then, snap. Blake's other hand shot toward his radio. In a blur, Marcus surged forward. His hand moved like lightning, clamping down on Blake's wrist just as his fingers brushed the radio. The sudden movement sent a jolt through the crowd. Gasps rippled out as Marcus's powerful hand held Blake's arm firm. "Get your hand off me," Blake barked, jerking his arm back violently. But Marcus held steady. "Not until you put that gun away," Marcus growled through clenched teeth. "You're not shooting anyone tonight." Blake's face twisted with rage. His pride, that ugly sense of superiority, burned hot behind his eyes. "I am the law here," he hissed. "That's not what I see," Marcus shot back. "I see a man trying to prove he's tough." With a gun in his hand and a homeless man on his knees. Blake's face turned red, his frustration boiling over. "I said, I know what you said," Marcus cut in, his voice sharper now. "But I'm telling you, you're done." For a second, neither man moved. Marcus's grip tightened, his fingers like steel around Blake's wrist. The cop's arm trembled slightly, and the gun dipped just an inch, but even an inch was enough to let the crowd breathe again. "You're not walking away from this," Blake spat. "You think you're some kind of savior? Some hero?" His voice cracked slightly, that arrogant edge now laced with desperation. "I don't care what you think I am," Marcus shot back. "But I'm not letting you hurt that man." Blake's jaw clenched. His hand twitched again, just enough to make the gun's barrel jerk slightly. The crowd gasped. A voice, panicked and desperate, rang out from the back. "Somebody called the cops." That did it. Blake's pride erupted like a fuse igniting. His face twisted with sudden rage, and with one swift motion, his hand yanked free from Marcus's grip. The gun snapped back up, halfway between Marcus and Tobias. "Back off," Blake roared. His finger tightened along the trigger guard. But Marcus didn't flinch. "You really want to do this?" Marcus said, his voice now low and dangerous. His eyes narrowed, locked on Blake's. "Right here? In front of all these people?" He motioned slightly toward the crowd, phone still recording, their red lights glowing like beacons in the night. Blake's gaze flicked to the crowd. For a moment, doubt flashed across his face. The arrogance in his eyes dimmed. He hadn't expected this much attention. He hadn't expected someone to stand firm. "You know what happens next," Marcus warned, his voice steady. "Put the gun down. Walk away." For a second, Marcus thought he'd won. Blake's shoulders tensed, his grip loosening just slightly. But then Blake's pride roared back to life, his face twisted with renewed fury. "I said back off," he barked, slapping his hand to his radio again. Whoop whoop! The distant wail of sirens split the air. Red and blue lights streaked through the night as a squad car came screeching to a halt outside the gas station. For a second, Blake looked relieved, convinced his backup had arrived. But when the car door opened and Captain Harris stepped out, that relief drained from his face. Blake knew he wasn't getting out of this one. The wail of sirens cut through the night air like a blade, sharp and piercing. The red and blue lights painted the gas station in flashes of color, a chaotic rhythm that flickered across the tense faces of the crowd. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. Marcus Grant stood firm, his broad chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. His eyes never left Officer Blake, who still gripped his gun tightly, knuckles turning white as he kept the barrel hovering dangerously between Marcus and Tobias. The trembling homeless man on his knees. Blake's expression shifted, no longer smug and arrogant. Now, there was something else in his eyes. Something sharper. Something desperate. The squad car's door swung open, and Captain Harris stepped out. The moment Blake saw who it was, his face paled. His fingers twitched on the grip of his gun, muscles coiling like a spring ready to snap. He knew Harris wasn't the type to tolerate nonsense, and Blake had dug himself into a hole too deep to climb out of. "Blake," Harris called out, his deep voice like gravel rolling over steel. "Put the gun down." Blake barely flicked his eyes toward Harris. His attention shot back to Marcus, and his finger edged closer to the trigger. "I said put it down," Harris ordered again, this time sharper. "I was just doing my job." Blake snapped, his voice cracking. This guy got in my way. That man, he jabbed his gun toward Tobias. He's dangerous. He was reaching for something. I was protecting myself. Tobias coughed weakly from the pavement, his thin frame shaking. I didn't do anything, he stammered, his voice barely audible. The crowd murmured again, some shifting uneasily on their feet. Phones were still recording, their red lights blinking like fireflies in the night. The air felt suffocating, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Blake, Harris's voice was low now, ice cold and firm. Put the gun down. Blake's breathing was ragged, sweat beading along his forehead. His eyes flicked between Marcus and Tobias, his grip refusing to loosen. You're done, man, Marcus said quietly, his voice calm but unwavering. This doesn't have to get worse. Oh yeah? Blake sneered, his face twisted with anger. Maybe it does. His arm shifted just an inch, but that inch made Marcus's heart pound like a hammer. The gun's barrel rose higher, locked directly on Tobias's chest. This is it. This is where it goes wrong. In an instant, Marcus lunged. Blake's arm jerked back as Marcus's powerful hand slammed into his wrist. The gun wavered, twisting upward, but Blake fought back, twisting against Marcus's iron grip. The weapon jerked dangerously through the air as they grappled, Marcus's fingers digging into Blake's wrist like a vice. Drop it! Marcus barked through gritted teeth. Blake thrashed violently, throwing his weight forward to shove Marcus back. For a second, Marcus lost footing, but he refused to let go. The gun swung wildly, too close to Tobias. The homeless man instinctively scrambled back, tumbling across the pavement in a panic. Stop! Harris barked, now sprinting forward. Blake's rage ignited. With a final roar, he yanked his arm free, but the motion backfired. The gun twisted in his hand, and his finger accidentally jerked the trigger. Bang! The shot rang out like a thunderclap. The sound ripped through the crowd, triggering screams and panicked gasps. Some people ducked, others froze in terror. For a split second, Marcus's mind raced. Had someone been hit? Then he saw the bullet's mark, a shattered gas station window now riddled with cracks. No one was hurt, but Blake wasn't done. Snarling like a cornered animal, Blake twisted his gun back toward Marcus. But this time, Marcus didn't hesitate. His arm shot forward, slamming Blake's wrist upward. The gun clattered to the pavement with a metallic thud. Blake lunged for it, but Marcus's arm snapped around his chest, locking him in a powerful hold. It's over, Marcus growled. Blake thrashed like a wild beast, but Marcus held firm, tightening his grip like a steel trap. Get off me! Blake bellowed. Stand down! Harris barked again, this time just steps away. His hand was already on his holster. Blake, don't make me put you down. For a moment, Blake froze, his mind flickering between rage and reality. His breathing came fast and shallow, face burning red with frustration. Don't, Marcus warned. Don't make this worse. Blake's body slumped, all the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. I got him, Marcus muttered, still holding Blake tightly. His heart pounded in his chest, but his grip didn't falter. Let him go, Harris ordered, stepping forward with his handcuffs ready. I'll take it from here. Marcus slowly eased his grip, stepping back as Harris grabbed Blake's arm and spun him around. You just ruined your life, Harris muttered in Blake's ear as he snapped the cuffs closed. The crowd began murmuring again, but this time it wasn't in fear, it was relief. People lowered their phones, whispering in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Marcus turned back toward Tobias, who was still sitting on the pavement, his chest heaving as he tried to calm himself. You okay, man? Marcus asked, crouching beside him. I think so, Tobias stammered, still trembling. I thought I was gonna die. Not tonight, Marcus said firmly. He reached out, gripping Tobias's arm and helping him to his feet. Not tonight. The distant chatter of the crowd was soon joined by something new. Applause. Scattered at first, but then it grew stronger, spreading through the onlookers like a wave. Marcus stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, before turning his gaze back to Harris. The captain stood next to his cruiser, one hand resting on the roof as he watched Marcus with something that looked suspiciously like respect. Nice work, Harris said, nodding. Marcus gave a tired smile. I don't walk away, and with that, The tension that had threatened to shatter the night was finally over. The air was still thick with tension, the echoes of the gunshot lingering like a storm that refused to pass. The crowd, though calmer now, remained on edge. A fragile silence draped over the gas station like a weighted blanket. Marcus Grant stood with his fists still clenched, his chest rising and falling in slow, heavy breaths. His eyes never left Officer Blake, who now stood in handcuffs, his face twisted in fury as Captain Harris gripped his arm tightly. "Take a breath," Harris muttered to Blake, his voice low but firm. "Because you're gonna need it." Blake's lips curled in a sneer. "I was just doing my job," he spat. "That guy," he jerked his chin toward Tobias, still trembling on the pavement, "he's a threat. I did what I had to do." "Yeah?" Harris shot back, his eyes narrowing. "Then you won't mind me checking the security footage." Blake's expression faltered, but only for a second. "Go ahead," he barked. "I know what I saw." He reached for something. But Marcus knew better. Tobias barely had the strength to stand, let alone threaten anyone. Whatever excuse Blake was about to spin, Marcus was ready to challenge it. "I'll get the footage," a voice called out. The gas station clerk, a wiry man in a stained t-shirt, stepped out from behind the counter holding a small flash drive. His hands shook slightly, but his face was firm. "I saw everything," he added. "And so did these." He held up the flash drive like a loaded weapon. Blake's face paled. "You sure about this?" Harris asked the clerk. "Positive," the clerk said with a nod. "That camera out front. It caught everything." The crowd murmured in agreement. Several people whispered to each other, their eyes shifting uneasily toward Blake. The tension hadn't disappeared. It had merely shifted focus. Now, all eyes were on Blake. "Let's go," Harris growled, marching Blake toward his patrol car. "I want to see what really happened." Inside the gas station's small, cluttered office, Harris stood before a battered old computer monitor as the clerk inserted the flash drive. Marcus stood just behind Harris, arms crossed tightly across his chest. Blake, now seated in a folding chair in the corner, stared at the wall, his face locked in a scowl. "Here," the clerk muttered, clicking the video file. "This is from about 10 minutes before you showed up." The screen flickered to life. On the grainy footage, Tobias could be seen entering the gas station. He moved slowly, his shoulders slumped, clearly weak. He wandered toward the shelves, pausing near a rack of sandwiches. Tobias grabbed one, hesitated, and then reached into his pocket. Marcus leaned closer. Tobias didn't look suspicious, he looked defeated. "That's when I saw him," the clerk muttered, fast-forwarding a few seconds. On the screen, Officer Blake entered the frame, moving fast. He stormed up behind Tobias, grabbed his arm, and shoved him backward. Tobias staggered, nearly falling. The sandwich hit the floor. "Empty your pockets," Blake's voice barked from the speakers. The clerk paused the video. "That's when I called you guys," he muttered to Harris. "Keep playing," Harris ordered. The footage continued. Tobias raised his hands, panicked, stammering something that wasn't audible over the recording. Blake's hand shot to his holster. Without hesitation, the officer drew his gun and leveled it directly at Tobias's chest. The crowd in the video froze. Some took out their phones. Others just stood helplessly. "Pause it," Harris ordered. The room went silent as the screen froze. The image now a chilling snapshot of Blake, weapon drawn, standing over a defenseless man, with no apparent threat in sight. "You still want to tell me he reached for something?" Harris asked dryly, his voice low and cold. Blake's face reddened. "He looked suspicious," he snapped. "He could have had a knife, or something. I wasn't taking any chances." "Suspicious?" Harris repeated, his voice rising now. He stepped closer to Blake, towering over him. "You put a gun in a man's face because he looked suspicious? You shoved him down over a sandwich?" He jabbed a finger toward the screen. "That's what you're calling protocol?" Blake's mouth opened, but no words came out. "You could have killed him," Harris growled. Blake's face twisted in frustration. "I was doing my job," he muttered again, but this time his voice lacked the confidence it carried earlier. "No," Harris shot back. "You were flexing your badge, and you nearly took a man's life for it." The air inside the small office seemed to thicken. The clerk shifted awkwardly, glancing toward Marcus. "I've seen enough," Harris muttered, turning toward the door. Internal affairs will handle the rest. He paused at the threshold, then turned back to face Blake. Give me your badge, he ordered flatly. Blake's eyes went wide. You can't do that, he stammered. You can't? You're lucky I'm not dragging you out in cuffs, Harris interrupted. Now hand it over. For a moment, Blake didn't move. His hands trembled, fingers twitching like he wanted to lash out, to push back, but the fire in his eyes was gone. With a defeated sigh, he reached up and unclipped his badge, slapping it down hard on the table. This isn't over, Blake muttered, glaring at Marcus. Oh, yeah, Marcus said dryly. It is. Blake's shoulders slumped, and Harris motioned to the clerk. Let's get this footage to internal affairs. The crowd outside parted as Harris led Blake toward the back seat of his squad car. People murmured, some shaking their heads, others whispering quietly to each other. But Marcus? He wasn't thinking about Blake anymore. He turned his eyes toward Tobias, who still stood near the gas station door, his frail body sagging against the wall. His eyes, wide, tired, and terrified, locked onto Marcus. You okay, man? Marcus asked quietly. Tobias sniffled, wiped his face with a shaky hand, and nodded. I think so, he stammered. His voice cracked under the weight of the night. You sure? Marcus pressed. You need anything? For the first time, Tobias's expression softened, just a little. He nodded again, this time more certain. Yeah, he whispered. Yeah, thanks. Marcus reached out and gave his shoulder a firm squeeze. You're good now, Marcus said. I promise. And for the first time that night, Tobias believed him. The tension inside the gas station's small office lingered like a storm cloud, heavy and unmoving. Captain Harris stood at the desk, gripping the flash drive that contained the damning footage like it was a loaded weapon. His expression was hard, jaw clenched, eyes cold. In the corner, Officer Blake sat slumped in a folding chair, his face twisted in frustration and denial. This isn't over, Blake muttered under his breath, his voice barely more than a growl. Oh, Harris shot back, turning toward him with a glare that could pierce steel. You'd better believe it's over. Without another word, Harris marched back outside, Marcus Grant following close behind. The murmuring crowd shifted as the two men emerged from the station's entrance. The air was still cold, and the red and blue lights of Harris's patrol car pulsed across the pavement. The crowd's whispers died down as they watched Harris stride to his cruiser, pull out his laptop, and plug in the flash drive. YALLL want to see what really happened? Harris called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Heads turned. Phones were raised again. The crowd pressed in closer, their curiosity turning to outrage, as they realized something bigger was unfolding. Play it, Marcus said quietly, standing just behind Harris. Harris tapped the keyboard, and the screen flickered to life. The crowd fell silent as the video began. On the grainy footage, Tobias appeared first, shuffling weakly through the gas station aisles. He looked frail, gaunt face, shoulders slumped, eyes empty with exhaustion. The image of him quietly grabbing a sandwich from the shelf was enough to make several people in the crowd murmur with sympathy. Then came Blake. The officer appeared like a storm, his movements sharp, aggressive. The video showed Blake grabbing Tobias's arm and shoving him backward with a force that sent the frail man stumbling. Tobias's sandwich hit the floor, and his thin frame nearly collapsed under the impact. Empty your pockets, Blake's voice barked from the recording. The crowd stirred uncomfortably. Whispers turned to sharp murmurs of anger. The footage continued, Tobias raising his hands, pleading in panicked confusion. His words were inaudible, but his desperation was clear. Then came the moment that froze the entire crowd. Blake's hand shot to his holster. Without hesitation, he drew his gun and leveled it directly at Tobias's chest. A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Oh my God, someone whispered. Dude never even moved, another voice muttered. The video played on, showing Blake advancing with his weapon drawn. The fear in Tobias's face, his trembling hands, his tear-streaked cheeks, was undeniable. By the time the screen went dark, the crowd had turned hostile. Angry whispers grew louder, some people shaking their heads in disbelief, while others openly cursed Blake's name. Man's a coward, one voice spat. He pulled a gun on a guy just trying to eat? Another said in disgust. Captain Harris turned back toward the crowd, his gaze hard as steel. You all saw what I saw, Harris said. And you all know what this means. The crowd shifted, eyes flicking toward the patrol car where Blake now sat in the back seat. His face pale, his eyes downcast. The cocky arrogance he'd carried just minutes ago had vanished. In its place was a man who knew the walls were closing in. From the back of the crowd, a voice rang out, sharp and defiant. Lock him up. The word struck like a spark to dry leaves. Yeah. Another voice added. If that was any of us, we'd be in handcuffs already. More voices joined in, a wave of frustration and outrage. The crowd, once passive and uncertain, had transformed. They weren't just witnesses anymore, they were demanding justice. Harris held up his hand, silencing them. Calm down, Harris said firmly. Internal Affairs is on their way. They're gonna handle this by the book. The book? Someone scoffed. What book keeps guys like him on the streets? The crowd's frustration was boiling over, and Harris knew it. He turned to Marcus. You kept this from getting worse, Harris said quietly. I'll make sure they know that. Marcus gave a slight nod, his focus still on Tobias, who stood just outside the gas station door. The man looked shell-shocked, like he couldn't quite believe he was still alive. Marcus walked over to him, his voice softer now. You good, man? Tobias blinked up at him, then wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. I didn't do anything, he stammered. His voice cracked. I just wanted something to eat. I know, Marcus said. I know. Tobias's breathing hitched, and for a second, his legs wobbled. Marcus reached out, steadying him with a firm grip on his arm. You're safe now, Marcus said. It's over. But Tobias shook his head, his voice still shaky. For you maybe, he muttered. But people like me? Ain't never really over. Marcus swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. Behind them, the crowd was still murmuring, but their energy had shifted. What had begun as anger was now something else, a sense of determination, a silent promise that they wouldn't forget what they had witnessed tonight. Hey, Marcus said, giving Tobias's arm a reassuring squeeze. You're not alone in this. Not anymore. Tobias gave a weak smile, one that barely reached his eyes, but it was something. As Internal Affairs squad cars arrived, Harris strode toward the agents and began recounting the events of the night. Marcus watched as Blake was pulled from the patrol car, his face locked in a scowl as he was handed off to the IA officers. Blake's gaze flicked toward Marcus, his face twisting with resentment. You think this is over? He hissed. You messed with the wrong guy. Marcus didn't flinch. No, he said firmly. You did. Blake's face darkened as he was led away. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus stood with Tobias for a moment longer, watching as the flashing lights faded into the distance. You still hungry? Marcus asked with a small smile. Tobias let out a quiet, shaky laugh. Yeah, I am. Come on, Marcus said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. I'll get you something hot. For the first time that night, Tobias's shoulders seemed just a little lighter. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting a warm glow across the streets that had once been cloaked in tension. The gas station parking lot, once a chaotic scene of fear and confrontation, was now quiet. The crowd had dispersed, the flashing red and blue lights were gone, and all that remained was a lingering sense that something important had changed. Marcus Grant stood outside a nearby diner, his broad shoulders still tense from the events of the night before. His mind replayed the confrontation with Officer Blake, the gun, the crowd. The sheer weight of knowing one wrong move could have cost Tobias his life. Marcus glanced through the diner's window. Inside, Tobias sat at a corner booth, hunched over a steaming plate of eggs, bacon, and toast. He ate slowly, almost cautiously, as if afraid the food might vanish if he didn't savor every bite. Man's acting like it's his first meal in weeks, Marcus muttered to himself. Deep down, he knew it probably was. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stepped inside. The scent of coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. The quiet clinking of plates and murmurs of conversation gave the place a calm, almost comforting feel. Marcus slid into the booth across from Tobias, who barely looked up, too focused on the food in front of him. You doing all right? Marcus asked. Tobias swallowed hard, wiping his mouth with a napkin. He said hoarsely. Yeah, I guess so. He glanced down at his plate, Like he wasn't sure if he deserved it. I can't remember the last time someone bought me breakfast. You don't gotta remember, Marcus said. Just eat. For a while, the two men sat in silence, the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. Marcus could see the weariness in Tobias's eyes, the exhaustion that comes from living on the streets for too long. His face was gaunt, his clothes worn thin. Yet now, there was something else in his eyes, something new. Hope. You know, Marcus said. Finally. This doesn't have to be the end of the line for you. Tobias let out a dry laugh, more bitter than amused. Man, people don't just get second chances. Not people like me. You're wrong, Marcus said firmly. Someone's offering you one. Tobias frowned. What do you mean? Before Marcus could answer, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glanced at the screen, and answered. Yeah, Marcus said into the phone. I'm with him now. He paused, listening, then smiled. Yeah. I'll let him know. He ended the call and set his phone down on the table. That was a guy named David Owens, Marcus said. He runs a foundation that helps folks get back on their feet. People like you. Tobias's fork paused halfway to his mouth. What? He muttered. I showed him the footage from last night, Marcus explained. He saw what happened, saw what you went through. David's offering you a job, Tobias. A real one. With a paycheck, a uniform, and a place to live. Tobias blinked, his face blank with disbelief. You serious? His voice trembled slightly. Dead serious, Marcus said. No strings. Just someone giving you a shot. For a moment, Tobias didn't speak. His hand shook as he set down his fork. His gaze dropped to the table, his fingers gripping the edge like he was afraid to let go. I don't know, man, Tobias muttered. I don't know if I can do this. His voice cracked. I messed up too many times. Yeah? Marcus said, his voice softening. Then make this the time you don't. Tobias exhaled shakily, his shoulders slumping like the weight of the world had just been dropped on him. What if I fail? He asked quietly. Then you get back up, Marcus said without hesitation. That's what second chances are for. The room went quiet for a moment. The hum of conversation faded, the clatter of dishes seemed distant. Tobias's breathing slowed, and when he finally looked up at Marcus, his eyes glistened with tears. You really think I can do this? Tobias whispered. Marcus grinned. I know you can. For the first time in what felt like years, Tobias smiled. A small, unsure smile, but a smile nonetheless. A week later, Marcus stood on the sidewalk outside a small maintenance shop on the south side of town. The sign above the door read Owens Repair and Maintenance, a modest business, but one that had built a strong reputation in the community. The door opened, and Tobias stepped out. His hair was cut, his face clean shaven. Dressed in crisp khakis and a dark green work shirt embroidered with his name, Tobias looked like a different man. Looking sharp, Marcus said with a smile. Tobias chuckled, a genuine laugh this time, and rubbed the back of his neck. Feels weird, he admitted. Good, but weird. You'll get used to it, Marcus said. One day at a time. Tobias paused, glancing down the street, almost like he was still expecting to wake up from a dream. I still can't believe it, he muttered. Last week. I thought I was done. Nah, Marcus said, shaking his head. Last week? That was just the start. Tobias nodded, his smile growing. Yeah, I guess it was. As Tobias turned to head back inside, he stopped and looked back at Marcus. Hey, he said quietly. I know you didn't have to stop that night, most people wouldn't have. Marcus shrugged. I don't walk away. Yeah, Tobias said with a grateful smile. I noticed. As Tobias disappeared inside the shop, Marcus stood for a moment, watching the door close behind him. The man who had once been just another forgotten face now had a shot. A real shot. And Marcus knew he wouldn't waste it. For the first time that day, Marcus felt the tension in his chest finally ease. The night's chaos, the confrontation, the anger, it was all behind him now. But the impact? That would last far longer. Some people call it luck, some people call it fate. But Marcus knew better. It was just the right person being in the right place, and refusing to back down. The fallout from that night at the gas station spread faster than anyone could have predicted. Within hours, videos of Officer Blake's reckless abuse of power had flooded social media. News stations replayed the security footage on a constant loop. The image of Blake, standing over Tobias, gun drawn, had become an infamous symbol of unchecked authority gone wrong. But the story wasn't just about Blake. It was about what happened after. And more importantly, it was about who stood up. Marcus Grant sat on his couch, scrolling through his phone. His name was everywhere. Clips of him stepping into the standoff, speaking calmly yet firmly to Blake, had gone viral. Some headlines called him a hero. Others said he'd put himself in danger for a man nobody cared about. But to Marcus, none of that mattered. He wasn't after fame, he just couldn't stand by and watch a man die. The TV murmured in the background, a news anchor's voice sharp and clear. Tonight, Officer Blake faces multiple charges including assault, abuse of power, and reckless endangerment. Sources confirm Internal Affairs launched a full investigation into prior complaints against Blake, revealing a troubling pattern of intimidation tactics and excessive force. In light of these findings, the department has announced major reforms, including mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. Marcus let out a low breath. It was satisfying, but also sobering. Blake wasn't just a bad cop, he was a symptom of something bigger. Something that wouldn't be fixed overnight. His phone buzzed. A new text message. From Captain Harris. They're calling you a hero. Guess one owe you a beer. Good work out there. Marcus smirked and typed back. You know I don't drink. But you can buy me dinner sometime. He chuckled to himself, but his smile faded when he noticed another notification, one that felt more personal. From Tobias. Thanks for not giving up on me. I owe you everything. A week later, Marcus met Tobias at Owen's Repair and Maintenance. Tobias stood outside the shop, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. His uniform, now dirt-stained and worn in, fit him like it belonged. There was a confidence in his posture. Now, one that hadn't been there before. Look at you, Marcus grinned. Working man now. Tobias chuckled, tossing the rag over his shoulder. Yeah, still figuring things out, he admitted. But I gotta say, I like it. How's the apartment? Marcus asked. Man. Tobias shook his head with a smile. I forgot what it feels like to lock your own door. I sleep better now, still getting used to it though. He paused, his smile fading slightly. Some nights, I wake up thinking I'm still on the streets. Feels like, I dunno, like it's all too good to be real. It's real, Marcus said firmly, and you earned it. Tobias nodded, but his face remained serious. I know I said thanks before, he said quietly, but I don't think I said it right. He paused. You didn't have to step in that night. A lot of folks saw what was happening, and they just stood there. Marcus shifted his weight, uneasy with the attention. I just did what anyone should have done. No, Tobias said firmly. You did what nobody else did. For a moment, the two men stood quietly, letting those words hang in the air. Meanwhile, Blake's life had unraveled. Stripped of his badge and awaiting trial, he'd been reduced from a man who once commanded fear to someone now shunned by his peers and despised by the public. During a tense interview on a local news station, Blake scowled at the camera, still clinging to what little pride he had left. This is all politics, Blake grunted. I was protecting myself. That guy looked suspicious. He reached for something. I did what any cop would have done. The interviewer arched an eyebrow. But the footage shows Tobias with empty hands, clearly terrified. Wasn't that enough evidence to prove he posed no threat? Blake's jaw tightened. Look, you think you know what it's like out there? He snapped. Every day. Putting your life on the line. These people, they're unpredictable. I did what I had to do. The interviewer let the silence linger before asking. If you could do it over, would you? For a moment, something flickered in Blake's eyes. Regret, maybe. But whatever it was, pride swallowed it whole. I did nothing wrong, Blake said coldly. The backlash was immediate. Viewers flooded the station's social media with outrage. Protesters lined the streets outside City Hall the next day, demanding better police accountability. But while Blake refused to change, the system had no choice. In the weeks that followed, Marcus watched as the community rallied around Tobias. The diner where Marcus had taken him that morning started offering free meals to those in need every Sunday. Local charities began organizing clothing drives and shelter support. The conversation about homelessness and how easily people like Tobias were overlooked had finally begun. And Tobias? He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. He volunteered at a local shelter on weekends, speaking to others who were still stuck in the life he'd barely escaped. People listened when he spoke, not because he demanded their attention, but because his story was